I had a discussion with someone from a rather secretive law enforcement agency recently, and the person I spoke to held a number of strong beliefs related to current global affairs and what caused them. When I brought up the arguments and research from some well-known academics such as Noam Chomsky, the person just went blank. This made me realize that what I had taken for granted, that is, that members from clandestine organizations are aware of and familiar with views outside of mainstream media, is just not always the case. Imagine, these are the people who shape world affairs from the background, and some of them have only a very limited spectrum of knowledge. This should not have surprised me because it is fully in line with what scientific research tells us about the proficiency of law enforcement in general when it comes to deception detection. This being said, if you are watching this video, you probably know who Noam Chomsky is, so there is no need for me to introduce him here. Just keep in mind that due to some technical limitations and his frailty, I kept the format more in the classical interview style with questions and answers, as opposed to a lively discussion, which is what I normally do. And the timestamps below will give you an idea of the extent of the topics we covered. I hope you enjoy watching the interview as much as I enjoyed recording it.
So I'm traveling this weekend. That's why you see me in a different background and setting than when we spoke last. But I did not want to miss the chance to talk to you. If you don't mind, let's jump right into it. I would like to discuss the Nord Stream attacks and who you think is behind them.
There are a few countries that know the answer. Sweden, Denmark, Germany have all carried out intensive investigations. They tell us they've completed the investigations. They're technically advanced countries, so they presumably know the answer. They're keeping very quiet. We can draw our own conclusions from that. Since we don't have their conclusions, we can consider the matter for ourselves. The question is, who had the motive? Who had the capability? Those are the two questions. Well, as for motive, we can immediately rule out two countries, Russia and Germany. They're the ones who suffer from it. Basically, they owned it, and it was in their interest. Of course, Russia's immediately blamed, but that's beyond unlikely. There's no reason why they should destroy a major investment of great importance for them. If they wanted to stop the flow, they turn off the tap. They don't have to blow it up. So we can exclude that. Well, who's left who had the incentive? Well, one country is quite frank and open about it. The United States strongly opposed the Nord Stream from the beginning, has continued to oppose it constantly, has said, President Biden, in fact, said pretty openly, we're not going to allow it to proceed. So they certainly had the motive. Well, who has the capability? Pretty obvious. In fact, the United States had just been carrying out major naval maneuvers in the exact region where the Nord Stream, where the sabotage took place with one of its major ships and high class technical equipment and so on. So as to who had motive and capability, the highest possibility is the United States. It's possible that Poland would have done it. They have the capability and the motive. Doubtful that they could do it without US authorization. So it's basically the same thing. If there's another possibility, I haven't heard it.
You're absolutely right with the naval exercise that took place. There were lots of ships there, American ships. I would ask you, Professor Chomsky, beyond the obvious, right? So at the moment, it's of course about money for Russia. Yeah? But if we look deeper than that, what are lingering reasons for this attack? So if we would assume a Western nation is behind the Nord Stream attacks, over and beyond to stop the money flow to Russia, what other reasons are there?
Goes back much more deeply. In fact, way back into the Cold War. Throughout the Cold War, there were, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were questions raised, serious questions, about the role of Europe in the international system. Will Europe be subordinate to the United States within the Atlanticist framework, as it was called, based on NATO, with the US making the decisions, or will Europe become an independent force in world affairs? The most prominent proponent of the latter view was Charles de Gaulle, who proposed that Europe, from his words, from the Atlantic to the Urals, incorporating Russia, would become an independent force in international affairs. Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik tended in the same direction. Olof Palme of Sweden had similar proposals. Naturally, the US conception dominated. US power is so enormous in the world that everything basically collapses under the pressure. So the Atlanticist vision was instituted. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the question arose again in a stark form. There was no Russia anymore, no Soviet Union, no Soviet threat. What should the emerging world order be? Well, Mikhail Gorbachev had a proposal, basically along Gaullist lines, a common European home, as he put it, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, no military alliances, no victors, no defeated, can't work together commonly for a social democratic future for the whole region. Basically, Gorbachev's idea. The president at the time was George Bush, the first George Bush. He did not reject it. He toyed with the idea, and it was based on a settlement about the most critical issue, which is, of course, Germany, obviously so for Russia. What would be the status of Germany? Bush proposed that Germany should be unified and should join NATO. Gorbachev accepted that on the condition, clear, explicit, unambiguous, on the condition that NATO would not expand further to the east beyond East Germany. That was agreed on all sides by the Germans as well, Kohl, Genscher, and so on. Unambiguous. You can read the documents. There's been a lot of deception about it, but the documents are perfectly clear. Everyone understood it. Well, George Bush lived up to that. He was followed by Bill Clinton, who immediately overturned it. By 1994, Clinton began to work on extending NATO to the east in violation of the promises to Gorbachev. Strong objection among the Russian leaders by Yeltsin, Gorbachev, later ones, but they tolerated it. It was also over the objections or the warnings of virtually the entire high-level US diplomatic corps, beginning with famous statesmen like George Kennan, Jack Matlock, Reagan's ambassador to Russia, one of the leading Russia specialists, Robert Gates, the very hawkish Secretary of Defense of George Bush, current head of the CIO, William Burns, also a former ambassador to Russia, they and actually dozens of others warned that the expansion is ridiculous, provocative, will cause dangers, and they particularly warned against crossing the very clear Russian red lines. No Ukraine, no Georgia. You look at a map, obvious why. Georgia and Ukraine joining NATO means that Russia's totally encircled, cut off from the Black Sea, from warm water, totally encircled by a hostile military alliance with advanced weapons aimed at Russia. I mean, even forgetting about the history, Operation Barbarossa and so on. It's perfectly obvious that no Russian leader would ever accept that. That was understood. Then can go on with the details, but after the Maidan uprising, the United States, Russia took over Crimea, moved into the Donbass region. The United States began to move openly to integrate Ukraine within the NATO, meaning U.S. military command, military training, joint operations, interoperability of weapon systems, new advanced weapons, continued so much that U.S. military journals simply described Ukraine as a de facto NATO member. President Biden, when he came in, extended it further. September 2021, offered Ukraine an enhanced program, it was called, for NATO integration. There were efforts, Russian, others, to try to reach some settlement. The U.S. didn't want to hear about it. Its U.S. State Department acknowledged, frankly, that they were not taking Russian security concerns into consideration. President Putin, who's, I should say, the one person who resembles a statesman in world affairs these days, tried very hard to convince Putin to reach an accommodation that would avoid the negotiations. This went on up to a couple of days before the invasion. Transcripts are available. Anyone wants to read them. Putin rejected it, finally, with contempt, invaded, and we're on and running. That's the background, but it is an act of, despite the provocation, which was very serious, it's an act of aggression that cannot be tolerated any more than any other act of aggression.
You mentioned NATO. So the first Secretary General of the NATO, Lord Ismay, stated the aim of the NATO is to keep America in, Germany down, and Russia out. As far as you can tell, is that still a, how shall I call it, doctrine or a goal of the NATO?
Well, I would put it a little bit differently. The aim of NATO is basically a U.S. initiative. And the aim of NATO is to ensure European subordination to the United States. You could argue during the Cold War that it was a defensive alliance. Frankly, that's pretty hard to accept, but at least it was arguable. With the Soviet collapse, it's not even arguable. NATO was obviously not a defensive alliance. In fact, it's a very aggressive alliance. It's constantly engaged in aggression. Either NATO itself or the leading NATO powers with NATO support, like Iraq, Libya, Serbia, Afghanistan, just in recent years. Highly aggressive alliance. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO expanded its mission. De Hoop Scheffer, who was the Secretary General then, announced that NATO's mission would be to protect energy sources for the West, pipelines, maritime sources, and so on. That makes it a worldwide alliance. At the last NATO summit a couple of weeks ago, all bars were down. NATO declared that the North Atlantic includes the Indo-Pacific region explicitly. It's expanding to the Indo-Pacific for the first time. U.S. allies in its ring of what they call sentinel states opposing China was brought into NATO. So NATO now is part of the U.S. confrontation with China. We're extremely dangerous to talk about it. But NATO is now a global alliance openly run by the United States. And going back to the comment of Lord Ismail's comment, main purpose is to ensure that Europe, in particular Germany, the industrial center of Europe, is firmly, which is a broad system running from the Netherlands to Slovakia, integrated system under German domination and control, that it remains firmly under the control of U.S. power. Europe has a serious choice to make. If it does decide to hang on to U.S. coattails, Europe will probably go into decline, maybe serious decline, maybe as far as deindustrialization. This is not only Ukraine, incidentally. Take the Netherlands. Netherlands is one of the major producers of the components in high-tech semiconductors. Well, the U.S. has openly declared virtual war against China, openly the last couple of weeks. It's not concealed. You can read it in the financial press, the New York Times. The United States is now committed to ensure that China not be able to develop technologically for generations. The way it's doing it is by using its control of supply chains, its general military and economic power, to coerce other countries like the Netherlands to refuse to provide China with any of the components necessary to develop an advanced economy. Netherlands has to decide, are we going to conform or go and become more independent of the United States? So far, Japan, which is also subject to this, has been working out ways to get around the U.S. demands and various techniques. Samsung in South Korea also has to decide, not just the Netherlands is the main place in Europe, but others as well. Are they going to subordinate themselves to the U.S. war against China, now under the NATO rubric, or will they move towards independence in world affairs? This is a fundamental issue. As I say, it goes back right to the end of the Second World War, taking new forms, more dramatic forms today.
If you would have to take a guess, what would be your inclination? Do you think that Europe will divorce itself or could divorce itself to some degree from the US influence, or will the opposite happen?
It's a big decision. Other parts of the world are already making the decision.
Yep.
Take Saudi Arabia, which has been a obedient US client since the state was formed in the 1930s. It's now breaking free. It's making more independent moves. towards Russia, towards China, quite openly, not following U.S. orders. Take the United Arab Emirates, same thing. It's a major part of the U.S. Middle East system. It's now also a central part of the China Maritime Silk Road. China's development programs in Eurasia are the land-based so-called Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, but also a maritime Silk Road that runs right to the Red Sea. In fact, it even includes owning part of the Israeli Haifa port, main port, where the U.S. Navy is. And the United Arab Emirates is a central part of it. Well, take India, the major third world power, out of the, technically non-aligned. There's been a good deal of deceit about this. We should be careful. Western propaganda claims that India has turned against the Russian war in Ukraine. And the basis for that is a comment made by Prime Minister Modi to President Putin at the Samarkand meeting, in which he said, "War is not the way." Big headlines in the Western press. India separates from China. I took the trouble of looking up the Indian government national website. Total fabrication. He did say those words, but he went in with virtually a love letter to Putin, saying war is not the way, we agree on that, but we have indissoluble links, we're working together as in the past, we're going to work together even more in the future, and so on. So it's virtually the opposite of what was claimed by Western propaganda. You have to be pretty cautious about this. Same with Indonesia, same with South Africa, Brazil. Other countries of the global South are just not participating in what they regard as a proxy war between U.S. and Russia fought over Ukraine. It's not our business, not participating in the sanctions and so on. Well, the BRICS, which was initiated pretty much by Lula of Brazil, will probably be reinvigorated by his re-election. It's a major, as I think about 40% of the global economy. It's not small. It'll be another independent force. So there is a great conflict now as to whether the world will be what's called unipolar, dominated by the United States, or whether it'll have multiple centers of power, be a multipolar society. Ukraine is a central part of this. Taiwan is another. It's all a highly threatening, dangerous situation as a new world system emerges. Meanwhile, while all of these things are going on, the energy corporations, the banks that fund them, the whole fossil fuel system, military producers are all utterly euphoric. The monopolists who control the food system of the world, a couple of major corporations, delighted. They're making incredible profits. It's a large part of what's driving up inflation, super pricing. And they're just glorying in the opportunities to destroy the world as fast as possible. All of this is happening. And in the background is the fact that the great powers must accommodate to one another. They must cooperate to overcome crises that face the entire human species, have no borders, can't be solved by one country. They're going to have to be solved jointly, or we all go down to inglorious destruction, and not in the distant future. That's the situation we now face. Right now, there's an international biodiversity conference, which, as usual, is collapsing, just the way COP27 collapsed because of lack of cooperation. In the case of the biodiversity conference, the United States is simply refusing to participate. It's saying it will not accept anything other than a voluntary agreement. Other countries want a mandated agreement to prevent the destruction of the biodiversity that's destroying us all. The U.S. says no. Corporate profits have to dominate. So it has to be a voluntary agreement, same as the U.S. stance with regard to global warming. Paris negotiations back in 2015 were aimed at a treaty. This was Obama, not Trump. They were aimed at a treaty, couldn't. U.S. Congress wouldn't accept it, would not accept any conditions. Has to be voluntary, which means nothing happens. Incidentally, today happens to be Human Rights Day. We're supposed to respect the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It's about the same. Core element of the Declaration of Human Rights is the socioeconomic agreement. The second, there's political and legal elements, socioeconomic elements, cultural and community elements. Core elements are socioeconomic. U.S., there's plenty of hypocrisy on all sides, but the U.S. goes beyond hypocrisy, says straight out, we reject them. Jeane Kirkpatrick, Reagan's UN ambassador, simply dismissed them as a letter to Santa Claus, ridicule. Paula Dobriansky, Bush II's ambassador in human rights, simply said we must dispel the myth that socioeconomic rights are human rights. They are not. It's a myth. Morris Abram, UN ambassador, Bush this time to the Human Rights Commission, vetoed the right to development that the other countries of the world were proposing. He said it incorporated the socioeconomic rights. He says it's preposterous, a provocation, and so on. What matters is the rights of the profit for private power. Everything else is subordinate. Everything. And as long as that idea dominates, we're finished.
You mentioned the next two crises which loom in the background. The first is a potential conflict with China, and the second one is the climate crisis, right? So from US perspective, the other way around, actually from European perspective, I do not understand why with the Ukrainian war, apparently the US drives Russia into cooperating with China. Should it not be the other way around? Should the US not try to isolate Russia from China?
You can ask a lot of questions like that. Why did President Putin decide to present the United States with its fondest wish on a silver platter? By invading Ukraine, he undermined the possibility for accommodation between Russia and Europe and forced Europe deep into the pocket of the United States. From the Russian point of view, it's criminally stupid. Not only a criminal war of aggression, but criminally stupid. That's the way great powers act. Back in 1990, some of the leading U.S. international relations specialists Kenneth Waltz, others, warned that the policy that Clinton was following was going to drive Russia into China's arms, and that we have to do what we should be doing from the point of U.S. interests is exactly what you said, separating them. Didn't matter. Clinton was much more concerned with the Polish vote in the election. He said so. I'm not making it up. When he explained to his friend Yeltsin that he has to incorporate East European countries into NATO, contrary to the promises, he said, look, I need the Polish vote. He's a local politician, okay? So what happens, somebody else will worry about it. It's same on just about every issue. There are very few statesmen in international affairs. Actually, Macron is an example now, about as close as you can find. His efforts to bring Putin to agree to an accommodation were very significant. Right now, he's saying we have to consider Russian security concerns. He's being lambasted for this, denounced. He's absolutely correct. And furthermore, Europe should understand this, if any continent should. Just look at European history. What Macron is saying is pretty much what the great European statesman said in 1815, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when they formed the Concert of Europe. They decided not to humiliate and destroy defeated France, but to bring France into the Concert of Europe as a co-member. That was statesmanship. It led to a century of a fairly peaceful century by European standards, remarkably peaceful. Very different from the Versailles Treaty. Did the opposite. It said, let's destroy and punish Germany. Well, we know where that led. Concert of Europe, sensible. Let's accommodate France, even though it's defeated, even though it was the aggressor. Let's accommodate it. We can have a century of peace till the First World War. Well, we have the same questions today. Are we going to accommodate Russia, China, bring them into a concert of the world now? Or are we going to declare virtual war against them and make sure that we all go down in flames? That's basically it.
Yeah. In the Western media, especially in the NATO countries, the impression is created that the whole world has a unified view on, the behavior of Russia. Yeah, that the whole world kind of is against Russia as a result of the invasion in Ukraine. That's a view that is not shared.
But it's perfectly obvious that that's not true. In fact, even Newsweek, American journal, pointed out that 90% of the world is not joining in the sanctions. It's not their war. When Putin goes to Indonesia, to India, I already talked about the lies with regard to India. Almost Africa is welcomed. If not Putin, Lavrov, foreign minister. They are not, the global south is simply not part of this. In fact, even if you look at Europe, majority of, where there are polls, like in Germany, a large majority are in favor of negotiations. Slovakia, even more so. In fact, this is now discussed an interesting split. In the New York Times today, you can read it. It's quite interesting if you remember the history. They discuss a split between what they call New Europe and Old Europe. Old Europe is the bad guys. Germany, France, Netherlands, all these old-fashioned Europeans, who have all these old ideas and so on. New Europe is the good guys. The Baltic countries, Poland, passionately anti-Russian, they're the good guys. That's New Europe. Where does that notion come from? It was invented by Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense under Bush II, when the US invaded Iraq. You recall, strong opposition in Europe, very strong, and Rumsfeld dismissed it. He said, we have to distinguish New Europe from Old Europe. Old Europe are these old-time pacifists who don't understand the need to go and blow up and smash up other countries, Germany, France, Netherlands, and Spain. New Europe is the good guys. Eastern Europe, they're willing to go to war and blow up the world. That's where the idea comes from. Okay. It's quite interesting. Spain was a very interesting case. Spain was incorporated in New Europe because the Prime Minister, Aznar, did support the US war. In fact, he was invited to the Azores for a meeting with Bush and Blair, where they announced the war. He was opposed by about 95% of the population in Spain, but that didn't matter. We don't care about that. He was willing to go along with us, so he's part of New Europe. I mean, if you think about what lies behind this, it is truly shocking. But now you read about it today in the New York Times. New Europe, the good guys who want to fight the war. Your old Europe, the bad guys who want negotiated settlement, like almost the entire world. That's the US and Britain, the traditional warrior states, whatever they can pick up in Eastern Europe, where there's passionate anti-Russian sentiment. That's the world they're trying to create.
When it comes to the power of the US, right? Of course, the dollar is the world currency, the world reserve currency, and we have the petrodollar. Now we see that more and more countries negotiate to become BRICS members, right? And under the umbrella of BRICS, as far as I can tell, there are also initiatives to circumvent the dollar as global reserve currency. So if that happens, what happens to the US? If the dollar loses its status as world reserve currency, what happens on a global scale to geopolitics and to the US? What would happen?
It's very serious, but you can say the same about many other things. Take semiconductors. The US has most of the designs, the advanced planning and so on, but the manufacturing and the development is somewhere else. Netherlands, Taiwan, South Korea. The US is basically controlling the world through what economists call rent, not the actual production, but the tribute that's paid to those who hold the patents, have the design, and so on. Take a look at Apple, the world's largest computer. They don't produce iPhones. They're produced somewhere else. But they collect the rent. They make the profit. In fact, if you look at the whole international economic system, it's extremely fragile. US-based corporations, US-based multinationals have about 50% of the world's wealth, which is phenomenal. But it's fragile. It's mostly by agreement with trade agreements, trust, and acceptance of rent-based arrangements. Suppose those are broken, all collapses. We've learned through the pandemic how fragile the global supply chain system is, but it goes well beyond that. It's a finance-based international system, in which production is substantially divorced from financial arrangements. And it's production that matters ultimately, not who has something on paper.
Yeah. I think there is little ambiguity that the unipolar moment for the US has passed, right? So when it comes to other countries outside of the Western nation to unite themselves against, I don't want to say the US, but against the West. Yeah? I saw some statistics. BRICS alone is about 41% of the world population. NATO countries is about 16% of the world population, right? So I try to find out in the next 5 to 10 years, if this trend continues, right? Where will the US be? Where will geopolitics be in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, today, I think India officially passed China as the largest population in the world. Africa is the fastest growing continent. The European countries, the Western countries, are declining in population. So is China. So there will be a big demographic shift in coming years. There's also a shift in productive capacity, just shifting towards Asia, away from Europe and the United States. I think in some sense, this is secondary to a much more fundamental issue. If the powerful states do not find a way to accommodate with one another, pretty soon it'll be too late. We cannot go on this way. We cannot go on pouring resources into means of destruction, whether fossil fuels or armaments. Just can't go on that way. Scarce resources must be directed to dealing with the imminent crises that we face. Not much time.
You said to me in our last call, the US has now a single airplane costing $2 billion, right? The newest version of their stealth fighter jets. At the same time, in the US, you have about 30 million people without homes. So from a domestic perspective, I mean, the discrepancy is just massive. Is there no movement within the US, that could challenge the status quo of the US with that type of military spending?
Biden administration just passed the largest military bill ever. Wasn't large enough for Congress, so they added tens of billions of dollars to it. Pour money in. There's a new, just a couple of days ago, the Air Force released a new bomber, California, new prototype bomber that's supposedly a technological miracle. Maybe in 20 years it'll be able to fly. Maybe it'll be as much of a bust as the F-35, which pilots can't fly, but huge amounts of money going into it. At the same time, as you say, there are homeless people dying in the streets. The health system is a total disaster. The United States is about the only country where mortality is actually increasing. It never happens unless there's a war or something. But mortality is increasing in the United States among the white working class, what are sometimes called deaths of despair. No hope. Well, that's fertile terrain for demagogues who can say, I'll be your savior. We've seen that before in the Netherlands too. You have experience. We don't have to talk about it. That's on the horizon. The collapse of the social order in the United States is astonishing. The bridges are collapsing. Can't get health care. People are starving. This is the richest country in the world with incomparable advantages that nobody else has, pouring money into destruction, opening up new areas for fossil fuel development, new pipelines. Is there a counter effort? Yes, there is. In fact, around Bernie Sanders, for example, which is very significant, a large part of the population, especially younger people, Biden, to his credit, accepted a lot of the proposals that came out of the Sanders budget office, backed by popular activism. Couldn't get them through. Congress just wouldn't accept them. The Republicans are 100% opposed to anything that might help the country and cut back corporate profits. Every single thing was shut down. A couple of right-wing Democrats moved in and killed everything. I mean, they finally passed a small climate bill, way below what's needed, but it couldn't pass unless it gave incentives to fossil fuel companies, techniques by which they could make money. Some of them are so grotesque that you can, I don't know if we've talked about it already, but so for example, one of the ways that fossil fuel companies can make money out of the new climate bill is by opening up fields, fossil fuel fields, which are have such a dense carbon intensity that they can't use them for oil, but they're opening them up to extract oil from them so they can then bury it and get credits for decarbonization. I mean, this is capitalism going berserk, totally berserk. But that's the way it works. You've got to maximize the rights of concentrated private power. For the Republicans, that's just an ideal that can't be challenged. The Democrats are more nuanced. Now the Republicans coming back into office, we'll see more of it. It's, I mean, we're in an age where all of the problems of capitalism have become magnified to the point of self-caricature, literally. I'll give you another example. One of the major problems today is that the Arctic is heating much faster than the rest of the world. It's exposing permafrost. Permafrost has huge amounts of carbon stored and comes into the Earth's atmosphere. Horror story. Well, scientists at one of the major energy corporations, ConocoPhillips, figured out a way to harden the permafrost so that it won't melt so fast. Wonderful achievement. Why did they do it? Because if you harden the permafrost, you can dig into it for oil. I mean, it's as if some evil demon is trying to show how utterly insane capitalism can be. You can't make these things up. I mean, by now, the fossil fuel companies and their lobbyists are compelling individual states to stop punishing, the term they use, to stop punishing fossil fuel companies by allowing asset managers to provide information, just information about what the investments are in fossil fuels. People can't know that their investments are being used to destroy the environment because that would be punishing fossil fuel companies. Try to make something up that's more of a caricature of capitalism. You can't. They're doing it themselves. I'm reminded of a comment by the great American satirist Mark Twain, who was very much opposed to the American invasion of the Philippines. His publications were, of course, suppressed, came out about a century later. They were very bitter attacks. He was satirizing the heroes of the Philippines, but when he got to General Funston, he said, "I'm sorry, I can't satirize him. He is satire impersonated himself. Can't make up a satire about him." That's where we are. Capitalism is a satire impersonated at this point, and it goes on without comment, destroying us all.
Professor Chomsky, may I ask you 2 or 3 unrelated questions that they don't fit really in, but I would like to ask you because you mentioned Olof Palme before. Who do you think is behind the murder of Olof Palme?
You can guess, but we don't know. He was a great statesman. Plenty of people didn't like him. We know about the answer in some cases. One of the most important assassinations, horrible ones, with enormous consequences, was the murder of Patrice Lumumba. The Congo is the richest country in Africa, could have been in the lead of development of Africa, has enormous resources, major country, had a charismatic young leader, Patrice Lumumba. Decolonization took place. He was technically in charge. The CIA worked out a plan to assassinate him, but the Belgians got there first and killed him. And the West backed a kleptomaniac murderer, Mobutu, who destroyed the Congo. Now millions of people are dying in the eastern Congo so that we can have cheap iPhones and so on. That's what happened to Africa. Consequences were enormous. There were also questions about Hammarskjöld's death. But the Lumumba case, we know the answer. Olof Palme, I think it's not known.
Okay. Another loose question. Why do you think that we in the West react so differently when we compare what happened in Iraq with what happens now in Ukraine? And specifically in regards to Iraq, Madeleine Albright said on live TV she found it justified that 500,000 children had been starved to death.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
We think the price is worth it.
So why do we, the West, react so differently between what happened in Iraq and what happens now in the Ukraine?
Simple matter of agency. When we commit crimes, they're not crimes. At worst, maybe they're mistakes. Somebody else commits a crime, it's the most horrible thing that ever happened in human history. Reincarnation of Hitler and so on. And nothing new about that. Take, say, the British Empire, a couple hundred years. Horrifying stories of crimes and atrocities. For the first time, in the last couple of years, for the first time in England, there's been a beginning of discussion of the crimes of the British Empire in India and elsewhere. First time, took hundreds of years. It's meeting resistance, but at least it's beginning. I'll show you a book if I have it here. A recent book.
How's it called? Empire.
It's showing up backwards, but you can see it. It's a new book by about revealing some of the crimes of empire. There's a much more detailed one by Carolyn Eggley recently. But just this is after centuries of glorification of the empire. Well, France has yet to begin to discuss its crimes. Belgium barely beginning. It goes on. It's just very, of course, the United States is falling into line. It's like other countries. We don't recognize our crimes. Take the invasion of Iraq. You can find almost nobody in mainstream American discourse, anyone come anywhere near the mainstream, who can acknowledge that this was an act of aggression of the kind for which Nazi war criminals were hanged at Nuremberg. The most you can say is it was a mistake, a blunder. President Obama was greatly honored because he said it was a strategic blunder. Wonderful. Just like Nazi generals after Stalingrad said that two-front war was a strategic blunder. And do we offer them the Nobel Peace Prize for that? I mean, it's also another thing. There's a simple racist element. Ukrainians are white. People who look like us. Iraqis are just ragheads, as American soldiers called them. They don't have to be taken into consideration. But even apart from the racist element, which is certainly real, simple matter of agency.
Understand. Another question. You began your career as linguist. And that's a question I wanted to ask you, I think, for 20 years, right? So for me, you are a commentator on global affairs, if you can say it like that, yeah? But how shall I say this? The fact that you were a linguist, did this fact contribute you analyzing what people say and what they do with the words, and as a consequence, maybe brought you into becoming this commentator on global events that you are today? Is there any connection between those two?
A lot of people ask that. A simple answer is that it's basically no relation. Slightly more complicated answer is that the chronology is backwards. I was much more involved as a child, even in political activism and concerns before I ever heard of linguistics. Actually, the first article I wrote that was published, if you call a Skoll newspaper publishing, was in 1939 on the rise of fascism and the spread of fascism and the fall of Barcelona, the Franco victory. It was very frightening matter for a child at that time. I'd never heard of linguistics. So this has been part of my life, all my life. Linguistics came along later, but there's basically no connection. I mean, there's a subtle connection that you can discuss about conceptions of human nature and so on, but they're pretty abstract.
Okay. And now I have a question that most people ask at the very beginning. I would like to ask you, how are you? But I mean, in the sense of you have a remarkable life behind you. I could imagine there must have been difficult moments. You know, it reminds me sometimes. I forgot who actually was the first one who said the world is round and evolves around the sun. I think it was Copernicus. I don't know. They burned him. Yeah, but I sometimes compare you with a person like that has a certain type of knowledge which could be seen almost as self-explanatory, but then faces criticism from all around. So when I'm asking you, how are you, then I mean today with 93 years old, you have a absolutely sharp mind and you have insights gained over your life. And still you see the condition the world is in today. So in this context, I'm asking you again, how are you today?
Actually, I just passed 94 a couple of days ago. So, well,
Congratulations.
the doctors tell me I'm pretty good for my age. So, okay. So keep at it.
Yeah. If you look at this,
gotta go on.
I'm almost done. If you look at what's going on today in the world, how does that make you feel as a person?
Well, we're at a unique moment in human history. There have been crises before. 1939, when I wrote my first article, it was very frightening to see the spread of fascism throughout Europe. It seemed inexorable. There was no way to stop it. We didn't yet know of the horrors of the Holocaust, but it was already bad enough. That was serious, very serious. There have been other very serious moments, but nothing like today. Today, we are facing two threats that might end human life on Earth. One, immediately, a nuclear war, which people are talking about casually as if it were a possible option. Unbelievable. It's not an option. It's inconceivable. Everything has to be done to prevent it. The other is the ongoing destruction of the climate. We have a short window, brief window of opportunity to overcome the crisis. The methods are known, they're feasible, but there's not long to waste. If we let it go on another couple of decades, we're probably too late. We'll reach tipping points which cannot be reversed. Well, it's never been that kind of a crisis before. So it's a very different sense of the world. And there's far too little concern about it, far too little.
What motivates you going on? It's my last question before I come to your message to the world, right? What motivates you going on? You know, I mean, you could well deserved with 94, and again, congratulations with 94, you know, to take a step back. What motivates you to keep doing what you're doing? And I don't mean this as a rhetorical question.
I've never understood the question. The question should be, why doesn't it motivate everybody? That's the question. It's so obvious why it should be motivating us. It was obvious in 1939, many times since, many times before. Today, even more so than ever. I mean, I have great-grandchildren. I'd like them to survive in a decent world. Isn't that enough of motivation?
Fully agree. You kind of preempted it. My absolute last question. I wanted to ask you, what's your message to the world? But I think you already answered that one, but maybe you give it another go. What's your message to the world?
Nothing profound. Take a look at the world around you. Take a look at your family, other families like it. Ask them yourself, what kind of a future do I want for them? Well, ask it honestly, face the reality, then grasp the opportunities that are available, and they are, and see if you can help bring about a better world. That's
as concise as it can be. Professor Chomsky, it was an absolute honor and privilege talking to you. I wish I could do something back in return. I will think about something. Yeah, I mean, I'm here in the Netherlands, and you're in the US. Again, it was my absolute privilege spending this hour with you. Thank you so much. Many greetings from Amsterdam.
Thank you very much. I should add, good luck in the World Cup.
It was yesterday. Yes. Not everybody was happy. Holland lost.
Too bad.
Best wishes.
Okay, thank you.
And that's it for today. Consider liking and subscribing if you appreciate the content. It costs you nothing and helps this channel. Thank you for watching.